Welcome back to the CBET series, Building Courses for Real-World Competence. In episode 2, we examined the anatomy of a competency and explored the components that make competencies meaningful and accessible. In this episode, we will focus on writing competency-based outcomes and explore how competencies can be translated into learning expectations that actually guide teaching, learning, and assessment. Now, a competency tells us what a learner should be capable of doing. However, competencies alone do not tell us how learning should occur. Competency-based outcomes therefore serve as the bridge between competencies and course design. They help us translate broad competencies into specific expectations that can guide instruction and assessment. This is where CBET begins to influence curriculum design. Sometimes there's a misconception that competency-based education replaces learning outcomes. In reality, competencies and learning outcomes serve complementary purposes. Learning outcomes describe what students are expected to achieve during a learning experience. Competencies focus on the performance and application expected in authentic contexts. Rather than replacing learning outcomes, competencies strengthen them by emphasizing what learners can do with their knowledge and skills. Before we can write competency-based outcomes, we first need to identify the competencies that matter. In competency-based education, competencies are not selected at random. They are typically derived from occupational analysis, which involves examining the roles, responsibilities, and tasks performed in professional practice. For example, if we analyze the role of a food safety officer, we might identify responsibilities such as inspecting food preparation areas, monitoring food handling practices, and ensuring compliance with food safety regulations. These workplace responsibilities help us identify the competencies learners need to develop. Sources of competency information may include industry partners, employers, professional associations, accreditation requirements, regulatory bodies, and workplace standards. Now, the goal is to identify the knowledge, skills, and behaviors that learners need to perform effectively in real world settings. Occupational analysis helps us ensure that the competencies we want our students to develop are grounded in the realities of professional practice. Once these competencies have been identified, we can begin translating them into learning outcomes that support their development. Effective competency-based outcomes focus on performance and application. As we look at these characteristics, let's briefly unpack each one. First, competency-based outcomes should be observable. This means we should be able to see the learner performing the task or producing evidence of learning. If we cannot observe it, it becomes difficult to determine whether competence has been achieved. Second, this should be measurable. There should be a clear way to assess whether the learner has met the expected level of performance. This allows us to provide meaningful feedback and make fair assessment decisions. Third, competency-based outcomes should be action-oriented. They focus on what learners are able to do rather than what they know. Competency-based outcomes focus on what learners are expected to do and demonstrate in practice. Fourth, they should be contextualized. Competence does not happen in isolation. It is demonstrated within a particular environment, situation, or set of conditions. Including context helps make learning more authentic and relevant. Finally, competency-based outcomes should be relevant to practice. They should connect to the kinds of tasks, challenges, and responsibilities students are likely to encounter in professional or real-world settings. As you write competency-based outcomes, it can be helpful to ask yourself a few simple questions. Can I observe this performance? Can I assess it meaningfully? Does it occur within a realistic context? And would this capability matter in a professional setting? If the answer is yes, then you are likely moving in the right direction. When designing competency-based outcomes, it is important to consider both technical and transferable competencies. Technical competencies are discipline-specific and relate directly to professional practice. These may include applying lab procedures, conducting financial analyses, designing engineering solutions, or even evaluating food safety practices. They represent the knowledge and skills required to perform specific tasks within a profession. However, technical expertise alone is often not enough. Today's graduates are entering a rapidly changing world of work shaped by technological advancement, digital transformation, and increasing complexity. As a result, employers are placing greater value on transferable competencies such as communication, problem solving, collaboration, critical thinking, and adaptability. These competencies can be applied across different roles, disciplines, and professional contexts. So, as educators, we should consider how our courses contribute to both forms of competency development. For example, a food science student may need technical competencies to evaluate food safety practices, but they may also need transferable competencies such as critical thinking to interpret findings, communication skills to report results, and problem solving skills to recommend improvements. Preparing students for professional practice is therefore not only about helping them perform technical tasks, but also about helping them adapt, collaborate, and respond effectively to changing environments. As you review your own courses, I want you to consider whether your outcomes support both technical and transferable competencies. Together, they contribute to graduates who are not only knowledgeable but capable of applying learning in a variety of professional situations. Earlier, we discussed how competencies are identified through occupational analysis. In this example, analyzing the role of a food safety officer may reveal responsibilities such as monitoring food handling practices, ensuring regulatory compliance, and identifying safety risks. From this analysis, we can identify a competency such as evaluate food safety practices in a small scale food processing operation against established regulatory standards. A common mistake when writing competency based outcomes is simply copying the competency itself and calling it a learning outcome. Notice here that the outcome shown is identical to the competency. While it may sound appropriate and can be accepted as an outcome, it does not help us design learning experiences or assessment because it does not break the competency into achievable learning expectations. Remember, outcomes should support the development of competence. They should not simply restate the competency itself. Therefore, the next step is to unpack the competency and identify the knowledge, skills, and performance elements learners need to develop. Once we unpack the competency, we begin identifying the outcomes that support its development. In competency based education, we start by asking what learners must be able to do in practice. We then identify the knowledge, skills, and attitudes needed to support that performance. Bloom's taxonomy can be a useful tool during this process because it helps us to select action verbs and determine cognitive complexity of an outcome. However, our goal is not simply to move learners through Bloom's levels. Our goal is to develop competence that can be demonstrated in an authentic context. Notice that each outcome here focuses on a specific capability that contributes to the larger competency. Learners first need to recognize food safety risks within the operation. They also need to interpret the regulations and standards that guide safe practice. Next, they must be able to evaluate food handling and processing practices using those standards as criteria. And finally, they need to communicate their findings and recommendations effectively to relevant stakeholders. Together, these outcomes build toward a larger competency of evaluating food safety practices in an authentic professional context. By breaking down a competency into supporting outcomes, we create clearer targets for instruction and assessment. Let's look at a traditional and a competency oriented outcome. Notice how the competency-oriented outcome introduces context and performance expectations. The learner is not simply analyzing information in abstract. They are evaluating practices within a professional setting. This shift brings learning closer to authentic practice. Competency-based outcomes are designed to support performance in authentic contexts. In competency-based education and training, it is not enough for our learners to simply acquire knowledge. They must be able to demonstrate that knowledge through performance. That performance is then judged against established standards. These standards help define what competent performance looks like and provide a basis for consistent assessment. That is key. Finally, competence must be verified through evidence. Evidence may take many forms, including observations, demonstrations, products, reports, projects, or other forms of performance that show that the learner can perform the task based on the required standard. This is a key principle of competency based education. The focus is not only on what learners know, but on what they can do and the evidence they can provide to demonstrate competence. As you develop competency based outcomes, consider whether learners will have opportunities to demonstrate performance, meet established standards, and generate evidence of competence. One of the challenges in curriculum design is writing outcomes that sound impressive but do not support meaningful performance. Try to avoid these pitfalls. Ensure that your outcomes are effective. Try to remember that competency based outcomes should always connect learning to action and application. Before finalizing an outcome, use these questions as a quick quality check. If students can demonstrate, apply, and transfer the learning, the outcome is likely supporting competence development. As we wrap up episode 3, take a moment to reflect on one of your current course outcomes. How does it contribute to a broader competency? Think about whether or not it could be revised to better support performance and application. You see, small changes can have a significant impact on student learning and development. In this episode, we explored how competencies can be identified and translated into competency based outcomes that support competence development. In the next episode, we will examine effective learning strategies for competency based training and explore how learners can be supported as they acquire knowledge, practice skills, and demonstrate performance. We will also consider how learning strategies can create opportunities for learners to generate evidence of competence in meaningful and authentic contexts.